multimedia artist whose work is dedicated to encouraging dialogue around ecological and social issues. Her multi-layered installations and performances have been exhibited in solo exhibitions at Franklin Furness, New Langton Arts, the Exploratorium, Sushi Gallery, and more. She has been represented in numerous national and international group exhibitions, ranging from Virgin Territory at the Long Beach Museum of Art to Weather Report Art and Climate Change, curated by Lucy Lepard for the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art. Her public installations include interactive nature walks at Carmel Mountain, the San Bernardino Children's Forest, Tijuana River Estuary, web projects from Seas, a sculptress recently created for the Outdoor Exploratorium, to If Frogs Sicken and Die, What Will Happen to the Princess, hosted by the California Museum of Photography. Ruth was a founding member of the women's artist collective Las Comadres and active in the group until it disbanded. Publications about contemporary art include essays in Leonardo, Exposure, High Performance, Tikkun, Women's Studies, The Communication Review, and With Other Eyes, Race, Gender, and Visual Culture. She's a senior faculty member of the Interdisciplinary Arts MFA program at Goddard College and a lecturer at the University of California in San Diego. In 1995-96, she was a Fulbright lecturer at the Autonomous University of Baja California, Tijuana, and she lives here in San Diego with her husband and daughter.
Thank you. Thank you.
So here's Ruth. We're so happy to have her here. She was in an exhibition we had in September titled Endangered.
Yeah.
And we are very happy to bring her back so that she could show a whole series of artworks that she's been working on in the last few years.
So if some of you were there in September, you would have seen some of the frog work from If Frogs Sicken and Die. So it's wonderful to have all of you here. I'll say a little about the work, and then what I really love to do is answer questions, because I think it's more alive that way. I've been living in San Diego much of my adult life. I actually came here initially to go to graduate school at UCSD and ended up staying. And it was about 2010. I was going to have a show at the Athenaeum, and I started to think that I really wanted to think about what was happening in San Diego County due to climate change. I originally had a whole other idea for what I was going to do, but I started just looking around, and I love to hike anyway. And one of the things that really struck me was that all the trees were dying. I mean, it started, those of you who have lived here for a while know that we had fires in 2003. Then we had more fires in 2007. Then in 2008, this area all over this side is about Pine Valley, which, but what happened in the whole area starting at Descanso and east was that all of the oaks started dying due to a gold-spotted oak borer, which is actually a little beetle that came in probably from logs, firewood that was imported from Arizona, possibly Mexico. And then if you look outside, there's an image of the Tecate cypress. They were also affected by those two fires and others. And I started thinking, oh my goodness, what's happening if we lose our trees? I mean, if you remember anything from biology classes, you know, the trees take in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen. The oxygen that we breathe in, there's a real reciprocity between ourselves and trees. So what's happening? So I started looking and I started photographing. So actually the first areas that I started working with were Cuyamaca State Park, which is back there, and then in Pine Valley, which is one of the most magnificent oak stands in the county. And actually, as it says there's a little video back there, that about 25 years ago they replanted because there's a lot of cattle in that area, the willows. You see the willows back there, and then the oaks and all the other ones. And it's this magnificent, it's off Old Highway 80, but you can also see it from 8 between Gutai and Pine Valley. And I just went hiking, and it's still gorgeous, but it's like, what's happening to all the oaks? And every year I would go, and there are more oaks. So I just started picking certain areas of the county, and eventually went a little beyond, that I could walk in repeatedly. And I often don't take my camera the first time I go somewhere. I just want to feel what it feels like to walk in the area, and then come back. And photograph and record the changes. Now, one other thing, you'll notice that these aren't just single images. They're all a montage of photographs. And there's a tradition. How many of you have ever seen the work of Ansel Adams? I don't mean to malign Ansel Adams, but there's this tradition that many people are used to when they think of landscape photography, of the grandiose, sublime landscape. And when I looked at those images, I think that they do express the power of nature, but almost in emphasizing the magnificence and the grandeur, it's kind of distancing, actually. And there's, even though they're used for things like Sierra Club calendars that are very much a different ethos, I think there's almost this notion of conquest, that there's this grand thing, and like, how can I climb it, or how can I scale it, or something going on. And I wanted to express a very different sensibility. And I find that when I look, sometimes I look just at a little detail, like, oh, that's a cool bug, or what's that butterfly? And sometimes you stand back and you look at the whole panorama. So what I tried to do in these images was to combine a series of glimpses, some of which are looking close, some of which are more panoramas. Some of these, like some of the ones over there, they're all of a walk that would be like a half mile to a mile. And so you could never see all of that. These ones of the Joshua trees are actually much more intimate, because they're mostly just a clump of Joshua trees and the other trees that were dying. But I tried to give a feeling sense of what the place feels like to me. There's just an act of love and respect in creating these. So I've tried to pick different places that called out to me to tell their story. I've spent probably the most time in Pine Valley because I go back there every year. I decided to go back there in spring because I wanted to give the sense of regrowth and re-life, rejuvenation at the same time that you see the dying trees. Joshua tree, I have a 15-year-old who was here earlier today. Unfortunately, she has a school concert that she absolutely has to be in tonight, so she had to leave. But it's hard for me to get away too much because she doesn't like it when Mom goes, and she also refuses to backpack with me. So I don't get to, like Joshua tree. I was here for the first time just last spring, though when she was younger, we've certainly taken her there. So it's not a place I've been to before. And I heard that 90%, if you read the text here, 90% of the Joshua trees may disappear in the park by the end of the century. And what's happening at the lower elevations is that the trees look fine, but if you look around, you don't see any little ones. Because the little ones, until their root system is established to get the water, they can't survive if it's drier. But I actually ended up, because I found out, I went there at the height of spring. Well, you don't make reservations months in advance. You can't camp anywhere, except if you're willing to put a pack on your back. All you have to do is walk a mile, and then you go off the trail. You can camp wherever you want. So I went backpacking by myself, and I started in the high country. I talked to one of the rangers, an older woman like myself. Is it okay for me to be out there by myself? She goes, yeah. I went, fine, because I was really more worried about other people than anything else. Sorry, but that's a comment on the world we live in. So I noticed that the Joshua trees were fine, but these are junipers. This is a pinyon pine that's still doing well. That's another one that isn't. But the trees are dying. And what's happened is that the drought is really affecting the trees, and bark beetles, the pinyon pines, are really sensitive to bark beetles. So that's what's happening here. If you look behind you, at one point I really wanted to go beyond San Diego, and I don't know how many of you knew before you read the invitations, or maybe you haven't even read it yet, that over 100 million trees have died in California since 2010. Yeah, how many of you didn't know that before you came today? So I felt like, how do we not know this? I mean, isn't it significant when we're losing that many trees? Why isn't this reported? So I really wanted to raise awareness. And when I looked on this, the Forest Service has maps, and you could look like where it's happening, worse or better. They do aerial surveys. So given that I wanted to use as little fuel as possible, and also my limited time away, I looked for the closest places to San Diego where things were happening. So I ended up going first to Walker Pass, where I was actually planning to just stop briefly. It's near Bishop on the eastern slope of the Sierra. And I stopped in that campground, which is just right off the highway. It's a highway that also, if any of you know where Lake Isabel, it's going towards Lake Isabel and from Bishop. And look at that campground. Can you imagine you're hiking all day on the Pacific Crest Trail and you come to that? In this case, those trees are pinyon pines and juniper. And if you look at the photo that's on the panel right here, a year later, they've all been cut down. What happened is it's a combination of things. We had a horrible drought in California, as you know, from like 2011 till last year. Scientists say, droughts happen in California. They happen periodically. And there's lots of different studies, but one study that was given to me by scientists as I've been collaborating with a lot of scientists at Scripps, Institute of Oceanography, which has done a lot of work about climate change. And they say that the drought is 36% worse because of anthropogenic warming, because of the greenhouse gases that we're spewing. No, this is called all the greenhouse gases. What happens, we emit carbon dioxide when we burn coal, when we burn gasoline. That's how we make electricity. That goes into the atmosphere. And what happens is that so the sun comes in and it creates, it blocks the sun from leaving so that it heats up the planet. And the trees are dying because it's out of balance. And what happened is that we're emitting all this more carbon that was there before because of burning fossil fuels. And once the carbon is in the atmosphere, it stays there for 1,000 years. So the fuel that your parents burned when they were driving their car 20 years ago, and maybe some of you weren't even born, that carbon that was spewed into the atmosphere is still there. And the carbon lasts for 1,000 years unless some of it gets absorbed by the ocean. So there's the more carbon we put into the air, the more it affects the temperature. So the trees are affected partly by bark beetles, but when there's less water, the trees can't make the sap to push out the beetle larvae. The juniper are very drought tolerant, but when they die, it's just because they don't have enough water. In the mountains, the bark beetles affect the pines. The fir died because of a fungus that happens when it's too dry. And I think the cedar died because of drought. Nitrogen, which is another pollutant that comes in the exhaust from cars, it actually acts as a fertilizer, but the fertilizer then causes all the invasive grasses to grow, which outcompete the Joshua tree. And the other thing is that the grasses are really, they go up in flames really fast. So it's everything being out of balance is what we're talking about. So here in Torrey Pines, I only have a few that are dying, and there it's a bark beetle problem. But what the scientists are concerned about then is what happens if we don't have the marine layer that we have now. In the corner over there is some tree stumps. And if you'll notice, there's an iPad in one of them. And I really invite you to play with that. What I did is I worked with scientists at Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And I asked, what variables impact the growth of trees? And we decided to use soil moisture. So they made models to the year 2100 of what the soil moisture would be if we keep emitting carbon into the atmosphere just like we're doing now. And that's called, the way the modelers call it, they call it the business as usual scenario. We keep saying, oh, we need to care about the economy, we're going to burn coal now, we'll worry about it next year. That's business as usual scenario. And then there's another scenario in there that's called the Enlightened government scenario, which is like, oh, we need to do something now. And you'll look at the tree rings and you'll see, and the way I've diagrammed it is that the worse the climate is for the tree, the closer together the tree rings are. And you'll see that the trees under the Enlightenment government scenario, the trees are actually wider than the trees are under the business as usual scenario. Technically, actually, as trees get older, their rings get narrower. But the wider apart the rings are, the more the tree was able to grow that year. So that meant that there was good conditions in terms of temperature and moisture and everything else. And the closer together the rings are, the harder it was for the tree to grow that year. It's the way I diagrammed this. And you can also you'll see all these dots, and they all tell you things that might happen in a given year under given scenarios. And this goes back to 1900. So they also tell you things that have already happened. And if you want, you'll also see a button there where you can write letters to the trees, just sharing your gratitude, or you can give a suggestion for what we can do to help the trees thrive. Another interactive thing, please, back in the back, you can write leaves on trees. Please do that. This tree is for what you personally would like to commit to do. This tree is what society should take. This person has said, stop dirty fuels, boycott greed corps, get corporate money out of politics, no coal, no petrol oil, no nukes. So whatever your vision is. Oh, and one other thing I want to point out in this corner, these are all images that were done by Barbara Sexton's drawing and painting? Digital drawing class. And the tree of life has been an image in so many cultures. And so the assignment was that the students could draw the tree of life in their culture, or what the tree of life meant to them. So I invite you also to look at those, and they've all written artist statements about them too. I started actually for a show in the Athenaeum in 2012, and there's this image, and the oaks on the other side are from that show. And I just am fascinated by it. It just feels to me more like the way I actually see. So when I go, I take lots of images. Sometimes I'll just be walking, but usually I find certain places that really, I just speak to me, and I'll take, look closely, I'll look far, I'll look here, and I just take like tons of photos. And then I get back and I start editing them and putting them together. And it's very intuitive how they go together. I haven't combined years yet. I may. Like in that tree, I actually combined two trees. You can see the tree behind it that still has needles on it. And because I only went there once, it actually is two trees. It's not the same tree at two different times. I may at some point combine years. With the Pine Creek at this point, I just make a new one every year of the same hike down the same path. Well, I've always loved David Hockney's work, and I love that image. But I mean, his is more, they're like all the same. And I wasn't consciously thinking about Cubism, but if you look at my own history as an artist, starting in 7th grade when we had an art project and we had to do something, what did I do? But I was totally in love with Picasso, and I was doing collages, taking things apart. And, you know, in 7th grade, the art teacher actually really appreciated it. Everybody else was kind of like, what are you doing? But, you know, the art teachers could. So I didn't actually realize that influence until a student of mine, not knowing my work, started doing the same thing. And then I said, have you looked at my work? And then I realized, like, oh, of course, there's an incredible influence of Cubism, which I had done for years as a painter when I was much, much younger. But I think I kind of it wasn't all conscious. The most important thing to me is to evoke the feeling. And to some extent, I sometimes start with putting the pieces together. Like I'll have a tree and I'll have a picture of the bottom and the middle and the top or whatever, and I'll put them together. But then it never quite ends up that way. And then from there, I think it's just what feels like it goes with what to try to get a view. And then I've also, from the earliest ones that are on the other side of that cube, was interested in like having some of the images fade away because the trees are fading away. So I've started playing with that. And I do have one area, I've never had time to put these together, but I work in Vermont twice a year, and I keep photographing the same place whenever I go. And I sometimes also go the other seasons. So at some point I will combine all the seasons together. I also have talked to people about showing this work in Baja, because I still have a lot of friends there, and also photographing there. That hasn't worked yet, but that will definitely be part of this project. But that's what I'm hoping, and what people have said to me today is that it's still beautiful, and I still feel that when I in the process of making these, there's a real visceral experience of the place, and so I hope that that comes through. The other aspect of this work is that I think it's really, really important for us to feel and to be able to grieve, which is why I have the thing outside where you can write on the rocks about the things that we're losing. That's based on a Jewish ritual when people die, that you put rocks on the grave. And I think that there's such almost a fear that if we feel, we'll get lost in paralysis or despair, but I actually think it's feeling and recognizing the loss and vulnerability. And when you really recognize loss, it's like you can't go back. You have to go to a different future. And if we could feel our connection to what we're losing, then I think it would actually free up our imagination to be able to imagine the radically different ways that we need to live, so that so that all of us can thrive. So if you look on the iPad, and please, you can look at that at home. I've written the URL where you can take that, and please take a look at that and write on the leaves. And so I worked very closely. I worked with Richard Somerville. I worked with the person who gave me the data that I was talking about for soil moisture was David Pierce. I worked also with Sasha Greshnikov. I have a hard time pronouncing his last name. Those are three of the people that Michael Dittinger, who's not there anymore. Those are some of the people that I work with the most closely. I also worked with scientists elsewhere. I just read people's papers and write to them, and some of them write back. Or tell me to talk to. So those are the people that I work with the most there. If you look at, there's a piece there, there's an animation that is courtesy of the conversations with Richard Somerville. Carbon that's emitted in the atmosphere stays there. The longer we wait to do something, the more rapidly we need to make change. So we need to act now. If we act now, we still have a chance so that the situation won't be nearly as bad as it could be. So I would say more than being hopeful or not hopeful, it's just a sense we cannot wait. Well, I think there's still scientists, that's again on the website, that say that we could get to 100% carbon neutral energy by 2050. And I think it's possible. And I think we also really need to think about consumption. I mean, and just what do we really need? Which I even worry about making big prints in the ink, but I hope that what I'm communicating is worth it. So I think I'll stay, and I'm not leaving. I'd be glad to answer more questions, but I don't want everyone to feel captive here. And please write your suggestions on the trees, write letters to the trees. All of us continuing to talk about it will really help. So thank you.